So one of the things that I didn't understand, and I think that contributed to not even really knowing what the word trauma meant, was that I grew up in a relatively new age household. You know, my parents took me to Findhorn at 13, going to Waldorf school, things like that, and they were both into growth and spirituality in their superficial way. And so I kind of thought that trauma was about Iraqi war veterans or Vietnam veterans, and I'd never been to war, and so I didn't connect it to me at all. And very interestingly, doing $140,000 of various forms of therapy and energy work, and is that not a single practitioner brought up the word, defined it, suggested exploration, suggested a book, and this is very bizarre. So I discovered what trauma meant when I asked a young man in a cafe what was most interesting to him in his life, and he said he was going to take a trauma workshop, and I said, "What's that?" And he explained it to me. And at the time, I was dealing with symptoms of PTSD from actually being severely hurt in a therapeutic relationship under the influence of psychedelics. And so, it ended up that I learned the most useful thing that I could learn at the time from a stranger, not from a healing practitioner. But the deepest thing that I came to understand was the trauma of childhood, being unable to connect emotionally in a deep and secure way with either mother or father, one, periodic hitting, beating, and I think most of all, erratic behavior, dissociative and erratic behavior by both parents. The lack of emotional repair available with both parents, after hitting, a beating, a humiliation, some psychological games, I'm leaving and I'm never coming back, etc. Abandonment out in nature, again, that kind of message of playing with an infant and a child's sense of safety and loneliness, that we lived in a pretty isolated upstate New York community, ironically, in response to, the idea of a Waldorf education. And so, in that environment, within the range of parenting, there was some very intentional effort made to be good parents, but it was mingled. For example, you have the juxtaposition of going to Waldorf school, having a godmother, eating good food, etc. And my godmother and kindergarten teacher at a Waldorf school saying that because I was hyperactive due to the trauma going on at home and the various abuse levels going on at home, because I was hyperactive, one of the expressions when a child can't calm down, because there's periodic violation. So when you have shouting for an infant, when you have shaking, when you have hitting, when you have, it's called paddling in my house, but beating, or, whipping a child with a belt, or threatening to. When all that's going on, and there's no emotional repair, there's a shaming. You're a bad boy, I'm never coming back. And then there's isolation. There's cultural, there's social isolation because, they wanted us to be away from that horrible culture out there, right? Which means that we're in that horrible culture out there, just isolated with the parents. So there's isolation. And, this leading to nightmares, and deep anxiety and panic. And, are the parents going to split up as they have their various fights? And there's no safe place to turn to. And then both parents are terrified of their own feelings. And so they're, dumping all of that fear of their feelings onto me in my feelings. And then plus all the various things of, just coming into the world. So as all of that fear gets expressed in fidgetiness and anxiety, in kindergarten, my kindergarten teacher at a Waldorf school said that there were witches down in the cellar. And because there was a cellar beneath the kindergarten building at the Hawthorne Valley Waldorf School in upstate New York. And she said that if I didn't stop fidgeting, she would send me into the cellar. This is me, a 4 or 5 year old child. And remember, in a Waldorf school, it's a media deprived environment, because in Waldorf schools you don't expose your children to television and blah, 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 if at all possible. So, we had the good Waldorf parents. So what does a child know who's isolated from the culture and deprived, through both media deprivation and also social deprivation outside of, what is a cult framework? It's a cult within a cult. You have the American cult, and then you have the Waldorf cult, and then the family cult, within the Waldorf cult. So you've got these three cults. And a child, the adults, the teachers, the parents are gods. And so when my godmother and kindergarten teacher said that I would be eaten alive by witches and sent down into the dark, well, the dark is the terrors of all those repressed feelings that the parents won't express and are giving to their child. It's all the terrified feelings that I'm a bad person, that I'm unlovable, that I don't deserve, etc. And that's why I'm being beaten or hurt or humiliated, etc. And so my teacher sent me down into the dark cellar to be eaten by witches. A fun kindergarten experience at a Waldorf school. And then there is no repair. See, part of the thing is when all these adults are ganging up to attack you, and then when they don't want to hear, who at the Waldorf school wanted to hear that their children were being abused? Well, apparently no one. No one ever asked. No parent ever asked, were you abused at school? Did this? None of that. Nor did any teacher at a Waldorf school ask if the parents were abusing you at home. So the parents protect the teacher by not exploring the abuse that's going on at school, and the teachers protect the parents by not exploring the abuse that's going on at home. Both punish the child for the symptoms of trauma, dealing with fight, flight, and freeze. But then both the teachers and the parents communicate over and over again, wow, you're so lucky. You're so lucky to be you. You're at a Waldorf school, you're eating this good food and all this. So in that dynamic, there is a masking of the abuse, not just with the passive not asking and not exploring, not just with the active abusing and shaming, but then there's a masking by coating it all over with, you're so lucky and you're so, you're in this little sliver of lucky children who is going to Waldorf school. And so with all that combined, you grow up and you think, well, I'm a lucky person and trauma has nothing to do with me. Then doing $150,000 of therapy and not having a single one of the therapists and more than 40 practitioners mention the word, I learned about trauma from a stranger in a cafe. And the loneliness is the complicity of silence. The loneliness is the complicity of silence, meaning everyone colluding to not bring up the feeling of terror and loneliness in the child. No one in or out of child rearing or therapy talking about fight, flight, freeze. So that being not really in my vocabulary. A sense of shame, because every child who is hurt and abused and abandoned in any way whatsoever takes this on and says, well, if I was lovable and a good person, I wouldn't be terrified, humiliated, Now, when a child is terrified and humiliated and goes into fight, flight, and gets stuck there and becomes, for example, fidgety or hyperactive, as it was called to me. Why are you so hyper? The interesting thing is the shame of the symptom, meaning the hyperactivity is because I can't calm down because I don't have a single safe adult who wants to know what's going on. So I don't want to feel the terror in my body alone, is what it gets down to. And I am alone because at school, they're covering the parents. At home, they're covering the school. Nobody wants to acknowledge that I'm being abused. And so the shame is I must be worth it, and that I'm wrong for being fidgety, as opposed to they're wrong for not helping me calm down, because I have no interest in being fidgety. It is an instinctive response to an abusive environment that isn't being repaired. But I'm being blamed and shamed for the inadequacy of the parent, for the inadequacy of the school, for the inadequacy of the culture. Now, in a culture where none of this can be talked about, because I'm so lucky, right? You have a deep level of isolation, because there's these deep chronic feelings and physiological states that cannot be talked about. And in this environment, I developed a relationship with things over people. Because, for example, my parents would lie. They would betray trust. They'd say, I'll do this. They would bribe and then break the bribe, for example, at a dysfunctional parental level. So if you do this and this and this, I will do this. But then I would do this, this, and this, and then they had gotten what they want, and so they would betray the child. So you have, which further communicates shame, like I'm unlovable. Even if I understand that the bribe is for them and not for me, once they get what they want, it's why, it's like I'm not worth being honored, an agreement being honored, etc., because we don't have to, because we've got the power. You're not worth it. And so there's the shame and the hurt around that message as well. And the therapy, a third of the therapy didn't work. A third of the therapy didn't work. In fact, sometimes I'd leave a therapist feeling much worse than when I went in. And they didn't want to deal with that, which brought up the shame. Meaning there's a tremendous amount of therapy that's not ideal, etc. But whether it's ideal or not, a therapist wants to be paid. And they didn't want to deal with feedback that what they're doing, etc., isn't working. And again, the message, you're not worth it. And you have to pay whether you feel better or worse, was one of the underlying messages there. And so I discovered that I had PTSD from a stranger in a cafe. And I started reading the book. I worked with Peter Levine's book, Healing Trauma. And then I worked I looked through all the different books. I couldn't read at the time because there was so much trauma. So I listened to audiobooks on Audible. So Healing Trauma. And then my favorite book was The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, because it helped understand the landscape of ignorance, the landscape of abuse, shame, incompetence, etc. That's all around us in many ways in our culture of emotional illiteracy, emotional ignorance. And out of that, I did some constellation therapy and some EMDR, which had mixed results, as many of these things do. The EMDR worked well, but the therapist was very flaky in the sense of, I may be going out of town, I can't see you on this day, call me next Thursday, that kind of thing. And it wasn't a strong enough container to really hold the emotional terrain that I was dealing with. And the constellation therapist, helpful in some ways, but in talking about sexual abuse by another therapist, they just ignored that. And understanding that the other therapist was, in a position of potentially abusing other people, they just ignored that. And the message, again, coming through, I, as a professional, have no interest in protecting the public. I'm just doing my little piece here. And so, a wound around that, and leaving the sexual abuse survival to feel like, well, how do I protect the public? I'm dealing with trauma. I don't know how to deal with all this, etc. How do I protect the public when nobody seems interested in helping me? And I know that there's some professional negligence and abuse that's going on. And so I would say that having the vocabulary has been key. Doing some EMDR work has been useful. Doing some constellation work has been useful. Confronting my parents around some of the abuse has been useful. Talking with some of my siblings who are dealing with symptoms of the same pattern. It's not personal. The child takes it on as personal, but it's not personal. I have 4 younger siblings. My sister developed highly addictive behavior. One of my brothers became incredibly dissociative and depressed. Another brother, highly addictive behavior. And I guess in the Christian fundamentalist form of compulsive behavior, the guilt and shame of not being good enough and constantly trying to be saintly and in a fundamentalist sense, again, strong shame and addictive behavior, and my parents, divorcing, and my father deteriorating into the shame-based parent, and my mother, dissociating and going off and, doing her thing. The symptoms are there that reflect and refract, the various underlying semi-conscious and denied parts of our culture, expressed both in a subhuman and a superhuman type of way, trying to rise above it rather than deal with what's there. So, I did a lot of therapy hoping that would answer some of this, and some did, but a lot of it didn't, simply because it wasn't dealing. Talk therapy, for example, can make PTSD worse, and so those were some of those times that I'd leave a therapeutic session without feeling better, and talk therapy is not necessarily the best approach for dealing with PTSD, which then compounded the sense of frustration and shame, Because if I'm doing talk therapy because my therapists don't have the skill to open up and understand the landscape, to even know that they shouldn't be doing talk therapy, that I need to be doing somatic work or, reading these books, etc. When therapists don't know what they don't know, but take money, large amounts of it, over a period of time to do what they know but which isn't appropriate, the failing of the protocol becomes the failure of the person in an unconscious transference, where the therapist not acknowledging their incompetence, in the same way that the parent and the Waldorf teacher, etc., never acknowledged their incompetence. The failure and the pain of failure that is a result of incompetence becomes the shame of the child and then becomes the shame of the therapeutic client. The therapeutic client, you think you're a good therapist. I think you're a good therapist or I wouldn't be paying you. I'm paying you. I'm taking the time. You're being a nice person, sitting there, empathizing, doing your little thing, taking notes. But I'm not getting better. And I'm feeling just as terrible as I did 5 years ago. And whose fault is that? It's my fault. And this ties in with the darker side of I create my own reality, working with Lazarus and Seth and various things. So if I'm feeling like if I've got a rotten therapist, I'm creating that reality. If I'm not improving with this nice, wonderful therapist, it's my fault, that type of dynamic. And so this is an ongoing piece of work, and I didn't discover it until my 40s, which should be a wake-up call for the amount of psychological and therapeutic illiteracy in our culture. It continues to be one of the deep pieces facing the childhood trauma, needing to ask for help, not having that help available in optimal format, feeling some shame about needing that help, feeling the shame when the help doesn't work, feeling the shame of the child that if I'm not being loved in that area, then I'm not lovable in that area, as opposed to other people don't know how to love in that area. And and just feeling in our culture a lot of unwelcomeness to talk about this, which is further like saying, it's like, well, if you've fucked up your life so much that all these therapists didn't help you and your parents and Waldorf school wasn't enough for you and it's like, oh my goodness, you must be such a mess. Well, take your messy self and don't bring it to the party, and don't answer the question when someone says, how are you? Don't tell us how you were doing. Just say you're fine, because we don't really want to know the truth. And so in that sense, these deeply charged terrors don't really have a place in the culture. A client doesn't want to hear them. A partner on a date doesn't necessarily want to hear them. And so, this is part of the landscape of growing. How do I grow and respond? And one of the things that I do around this is go to Thailand, because in Thailand, emotions, all the emotions that all of this brings up, are welcome. If I cry in Thailand, I'm going to be comforted by strangers, because that's what happens. If I cry in America, I can't even cry in America because it makes the people around me so uncomfortable. And that's, again, I don't want to go through the shame enactment where the inadequacy of my culture gets transferred into the message that I'm not worth loving. Because when I go into the shame and the tears around this domain, I need comforting. Now, in a culture that doesn't know how to comfort a crying man in this amount of pain, the inadequacy of my culture becomes the message that I'm not worth loving again. And so if I cry in a culture that knows how to love me in that terrain, then I don't get the additional burden of shame that after 40 years of being blindsided and not knowing what's going on and having it sugar-coated with how lucky I was and da-da-da-da-da, and in a denial pattern at school and at home and in therapy, then to discover the grief of that, the lost opportunities for intimacy. Because as I said, I developed a relationship with things over people because things were more solid. But then I become weird and antisocial, as opposed to my culture gets acknowledged for being so frightening to me that as every child naturally tries to bond with both parents and through that template, but by extension to connect with everyone else, that didn't and couldn't happen in my house. And so I had to form a relationship with something to learn regulation skills, so I formed a relationship with things. Things don't lie. Things do what they do. A stapler doesn't suddenly fly off the handle and have a rage at you. And so I'd rather relate to the stapler than Mom. And so, but in the relationship with things, I develop engineering talents and things of that nature and learn about design. But it's a coping mechanism of grief and abuse. It's not really that a child, an infant, etc., really would rather study stapler designs than have secure, healthy attachments with both their parents and family. And so, this has been a fallout. The need for control of my environment to deal with the helplessness induced by, emotionally explosive, physically explosive parents that didn't know how to repair in an isolated environment. The need to study books and things again, to be in my head because being in my body was so painful. Again, sometimes being mirrored back at me as I'm too in my head, as opposed to we are not safe enough for you to come down into your body and your feelings. What do we have to do to be safe for you to enter your body and tell us your feelings, as opposed to what do you have to do to fix the problem that after being psychologically and physically traumatized in a denial pattern for decades, that we want you to come in and feel all those feelings of helplessness and pain and terror in a culture that doesn't know how to do that, to be there with you in a culture that will abandon you in those feelings and then shame you for having them as a man, and then give you the message that you're not worth loving because we won't comfort you in your tears because we just don't want to deal with it. And so all of this, I would say, fits into the pattern of an emotionally and psychologically illiterate and abusive culture, transferring the shame of that illiteracy and the shame of that inadequacy onto the child who takes it in the message that I'm not worth loving, that I'm not lovable. And that, even after $150,000 of therapy, even after the diet, even after Findhorn, that these things don't get resolved to such an extent that then, I literally have to scour the globe and find a place like Thailand where I don't feel actively shamed 10 times less is how I would say. I do feel actively shamed in Thailand in areas, but 10 times less than in my own culture. And that's really been one of my biggest responses, is simply to, leave my culture and find a people in a culture where more sensitivity, more femininity, more emotions, more individuality is accepted in that Buddhist framework of acceptance and understanding and emotions being welcome.